Hello and welcome to the Comic Literate Podcast, the podcast that does deep dives into the best of comic books, graphic novels, mangas, penny dreadfuls, webcomics, newspaper comics, essentially any single frame illustrations where the characters use bubbles to talk or think. I think that's a fair summary of the things we're going to be covering, right?
I think that's a reasonable assessment. What's really upsetting is that my kitten chose that moment to climb the curtain.
Oh yeah, he scaled the walls like Spider-Man.
Yeah, she was on it, mate. How dare you misgender my cat?
Oh god. That's because I thought of Spider-Man. I was like, that's the worst thing you can do in 2022.
Is misgender a cat?
Yeah.
Oh, that will get you cancelled.
Yeah. I mean, good thing we're starting off episode 1 on such a first episode. No one listens, but they've already been cancelled. And then we get picked up by Joe Rogan. Anyway.
We end up on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about cat genders.
Exactly. So that's not what the podcast is about.
No,
should probably get that across. But this is a podcast about comic books, graphic novels, the things I mentioned previously. Some, not all. Some were jokes. Some were real. Find out as we go. I am your host, the soon-to-be known as Comic Stan, providing no one has trademarked that already. We will see. But real name is Ryan, and with me, as always, even though it's only the first episode, is my host, this guy right here, whose name is Jamie.
Hello, my name is Jamie. I don't have a pseudonym.
No pseudonyms?
I mean, maybe we'll make one for me, and we can just quietly...
As we go, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I could make up a surname for you each week, because obviously we're not using real surnames for the tax man, obviously.
Yeah, fuck that guy.
Yeah. Obviously, also, big thing, this podcast will be doing swears, so obviously, because what's the point of podcast if you can't do swears?
Did I swear?
Yeah, of course. We're less than a minute into it, and we're establishing very quickly. So if there was any parents listening, oh, let's check out this. You like comic books? Let's turn on this. Oh God, turn it off. We've established very quickly what we're about and what we're doing. So, but I think we're off to a good start, both in this episode and it being the first episode.
I think we're doing well.
Yeah, and the cat is the only unprofessional thing about our setup right now because people can't see, so they can't see where we're at. So as far as they know, it's just the cat, and that's the only...
We're in a completely white sound studio.
Yes.
With a kitten.
With very professional setup. There's no mic arms attached to chairs because the table has a weird lip on it or anything like that.
And the cat isn't bemused by the arm.
I'm amazed that the wires are still all intact.
It's incredible, really, isn't it?
Because when people say cat, they might think overactive cat. She's still a kitten, so kittens love things that hang off the side of tables. That's everything's a toy. Really,
absolutely, yeah, no. And we have filled this room full of low-hanging cables.
Yes.
And foreign objects that she can play with.
At what point does this become the cat podcast? Is there a set amount of time where it's well, boys, you've spoken about cats for an hour, so now it's a cat podcast now.
It is the internet.
The podcast authority will come round and...
Yeah. I feel like this is no longer a comic book podcast. This is now the cat podcast.
Then we'll have to do a comic book about cats. Does the Cats musical, did they ever have a comic book?
I bet they did.
We could do that as a key to get out of Cats, transition back into comic books.
Absolutely. 1 minute. You talk while I Google.
So this is going to be a common theme, I think, where one of us has to just fill dead air while the other Googles something because we're not that quick at Googling.
There are multiple Cats the musicals. Most notably...
Multiple musicals, yeah.
This is the problem with Googling while you podcast, is that you lose the ability to speak.
It's why Joe Rogan Experience has the guy to Google, but then
do they have a guy?
Well, they have a guy, right? And I'm not saying I'm a fan of Joe Rogan podcast, but I've seen it. But they have a guy, and then Joe just stares at him while he's Googling. He's like, Jamie, pull that up, and he just stares at him
what's the point of him? He can just Google it.
And then something comes up and he reads it in a kind of reading to himself kind of way, eight ripped a guy's face off. Yeah, interesting. Anyway, basically we need to get that guy, a guy like that at some point for us. We'll hire someone once the money starts coming in, which I'm sure it will any day now.
Yeah, any day now.
Yeah. Anyway, I think a thing to say up the top, I don't know if it's going to be every episode or not, but for any new listeners, I mean, everyone's going to be a new listener at this point, but any new listeners, this is a comic book podcast where the focus will be mainly on non-superhero comic books.
Yeah, because fuck superhero comic books.
Well, I'm the superhero guy, so I'm not quite on that level, but it's an underappreciated, under-focused area of the medium. And it's interesting because there's not many mediums where you have to be like, we're doing films. And so people are like, oh, horror films? Like, no, the rest of, or all of them, not just that one genre. Comic books is the only one that has that, where it's like, there's one genre that people assume you're talking about if you say...
What's really interesting is comic books have now become so popular in film that assumption almost exists now. Like, it would be difficult to talk about AAA films now without talking about Marvel.
Yeah, exactly. They're becoming their own genre. But like, but then equally, if you spoke to someone and, oh, the cat's on me now. But equally, if you spoke to someone and you were like, oh, let's watch a film, and if someone was like, oh, do you want to watch a film? You'd be like, oh yeah, Marvel film, and they'd be like, oh no, I was thinking something else. But for someone to be like, oh, I thought all films were superhero films.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But some people do think that about comics. Like, some people have, like, superhero comics, and then, like, was it the Beano or the Dandy or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
But, or Where's Wally? Does that count? I don't know. But the main thing is the focus is going to be on non-superhero comics. We are occasionally going to do superhero comics because there are some great ones there. We're going to occasionally do some bad ones. We're going to, whatever's interesting. But the main focus is going to be on non-superhero comics because that's underappreciated. And we're going to, I think we both have a love of comic books as a medium, not as necessarily as superhero comics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
I think unserialized comic books. I know the first one we're going to talk about is absolutely serialized. But unserialized comic books, like graphic novels, are a really underappreciated kind of part genre in the medium. And
to be fair, even the comic book we're doing today is, you can technically say it's serialized in the sense that, well, it was a continuing series, but I think the difference you mean is, I don't know what the specific wording is, but like superhero comics that go on literally for decades and never stop versus... ones that never stop versus comics that, like the one we're talking about today, has like a start and an end. And the only reason it goes on for years is because a lot of these comics are monthly releases.
Yes.
So if you look at something that's like 20 issues, that doesn't sound like much, but then that's 2 years almost.
Yeah.
So it seems like a long time. And also, just as a preference, I much prefer reading comics in one go. I hate reading like one a month.
Are you a binge reader?
Yeah, because like every time, the thing with comics, they're so small, like the issues normally are so small that if you get one that you've been following, rarely they'll do like a summary of what's happened so far. And if it was a month ago that you last read the last issue, which was only like 20 pages, and if they're particularly good, they're not just like story heavy. There's like some nuance and some some story that take a while, a bit slow burner.
I must admit, every comic book that I've read that has been ongoing, I've picked up and put down in a way that I haven't with something that was already finished.
Yeah, because you can just get through it.
A little clue as to what we're talking about today. That happened to me really badly with Saga.
Okay, right.
Where...
Well, you got into Saga. We both did. It's still not finished.
I know, and I would wait 6 months and read 6 issues at a time, as opposed to buying an issue every month. Buying an issue. Nobody buys these things, do they?
I mean, for all legal purposes, they are all bought and paid for and everything like
Absolutely,
that.
Yes.
I so you mean like physically buying a copy versus like just getting on Comixology or whatever the retailer is. I'm at a thing where I read all my comics online, but if there's a particular issue of something that I like, I'll go out of my way to get a physical one. Mainly because I just like going into comic book shops and like
great, aren't they?
But I see some people who like, oh yeah, they get their like monthly order of like all Marvel and DC, and I'm like, how do you have room in your house for like what are you doing with them? Are you binning them afterwards or what? Like,
we were in New York recently and we went into an amazing comic book store, which I forget the name of. It was in Williamsburg, because of course it was in fucking Williamsburg. But it was this really cool independent comic book store, and they had these huge boxes of like vintage and unsold comics, and they were incredible. They were so cool. Like, some of them were so old the pages were starting to brown, and
those ones in like individual plastic seals.
Exactly that. And they were like $1 a piece. And I could have spent $100 in there quite happily on just a huge stack of them. But then you look around your tiny place that you live and go, I haven't got room for a physical comic book collection. Like, I think they're more burdensome than other media, because they stack up so quickly, don't they?
Yeah, there's a thing that I've heard in the comic community where, so like some comic book collectors, they have what's called yard boxes.
Yeah.
And they'll literally like fill rooms with these yard boxes, and then they'll like use those. I'm being attacked by a cat.
1 minute. Stevie, come here. Did she get you? Oh, mate, she got you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, all right.
Just honestly, mate, she's not a dog. She's a cat. You can throw her.
That's all right.
Animal cruelty.
First episode cancelled. They threw a cat. We're gonna be like that woman with the cat in the bin. And so, you know what? That video was evil. Like that woman was a bitch. But if a cat was attacking you, punt it across the road.
Absolutely,
self-defense against a cat. Like the one in the video was doing nothing, but like if a cat's attacking you, like have at
like,
it.
I'm very fond of my cat, but she is being a dick to you right now. Yeah. It might be that you reek of dog.
Well, maybe. I've definitely got battle scars from this podcast already.
It's intense. It's extreme podcasting.
I mean, no one can say they're more dedicated to the art of podcasting than me at this point. No one has been attacked by a live animal while listening to their co-host talk and just going,
lovely, wonderful, yeah.
Excuse me, I'm just going to pass out for 2 seconds.
It is time for her to be yeeted.
She's given me the eyes now. She's like those eyes, like I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
And then she's 1 second from attacking again. Right, this is not good content for listening people. Just know there's a small black kitten that has drawn blood. That's all you need to know. So the comic that we'll be diving into first, I think, is a very special one for us, especially. I mean, it's one of I would go so far as to say that generally it's one of the most popular comics of all time.
Is it?
Oh, for sure, yeah. It's at least one of the most. The writer's one of the most popular comic writers. But for me personally, it's my favorite comic book of all time. And the other thing is, it's the first comic book that you read because I got you into it.
Yeah, it is.
So it's special in a lot of ways.
Oh, mate, she needs to be yeeted.
Come on. All right, down you go. We will fight again one day. We will do battle once again.
In Valhalla, we will fight and feast anew.
I'm going to need bandages. Anyway. So the comic we're discussing after the cat has done... she's got a box now. She's fine. She'll be preoccupied. The comic we're talking about today is Why the Last Man.
Yes.
And as I said, it's special. It's my favorite. It's just a generally great comic book. And it's just a great place to start because I think it really embodies that kind of independent comic vibe for me, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
There's been famous comics before, but the ones that were famous before, I think, were big superhero ones or superhero adjacent.
Yeah.
So it was released 2002, so it's kind of that era where comics started being taken seriously as pieces of literature.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's going to be ones before that which did well. I think the most notable one before that was, like, for example, Sandman. Yeah. That was one that was like the late 90s, which was, I think, that one's kind of widely considered like the first taken seriously comic. But what's interesting is that the Sandman was released under the Vertigo title of DC, which is also what this one was released under. Yeah. So that's part of what we're going to get into now. I've just got some copied text from Wikipedia just about the comic, and for people who are like, you shouldn't be using Wikipedia, it's like, right, fuck off. About anyone who's taking the piss out of Wikipedia needs to fucking step back, right? Because Wikipedia is a valuable tool and asset. And I hate that there's a culture now where teachers are like, anyone can change Wikipedia. It's like, there are people literally manning it and providing sources for everything that's on there. So,
this free encyclopedia, this open source, gets vandalized every once in a while. Fuck off.
Anyone who has ever taken the piss out of Wikipedia or denied its usefulness needs to go there and donate today. And I don't work for Wikipedia, but
has anybody ever actually donated to Wikipedia?
I donated. They asked me like 100 times, and I'm like 101.
How much did you give them?
Like £2. They were literally like, if you give us £2, we'll probably be all right.
Yeah.
I was like, I fucking use it like every day, so yeah, I'm just gonna give some. But yeah, this is from Wikipedia. If you're like, that's actually wrong, it's like, well, take it up with them. But they're decent.
Or go and change it.
Yeah, go on and change it, but provide sources. That's the thing. The sources are all there. They all link to the third-party sources. They're like, you can't use Wikipedia because you're not giving sources. The sources are on the page. Like, I don't know. I get bent up about this.
Do you get upset with people?
This is going to be weekly. This is going to be like every episode. It's going to like, and another thing about Wikipedia.
We've become the Cat Wikipedia podcast.
Yeah. So I was like, when are they getting to the comics? Like first we do cats, Wikipedia, probably something else. So, as summarized in Wikipedia, Why the Last Man is a post-apocalyptic science fiction comic book series by Brian K.Vaughan and, I hope I'm pronouncing it, Pia Guerra, published by Vertigo from 2002-2008. The series centers on Yorick Brown and his pet capuchin monkey Ampersand, the only males who survived the apparent global androcide, which I'm guessing is the male version of whatever the female version of that is.
Yeah.
The series was published in 60 issues by Vertigo and collected in a series of 10 paperback volumes and later a series of 5 hardcover deluxe volumes, which I think is how we read. It was the 10 volumes.
Yeah.
The series covers were primarily by J.G. Jones and Massimo Cannavale, and the series received 3 Eisner Awards. Now, this is what I was going to say before about comics being considered literature, is the Eisner Award, as I recently discovered, and I probably should have known beforehand, but the Eisner Award is essentially the comic book Oscar. So now, because of the quality of comics that have received the Eisner Awards, that they have elevated the award to be considered like alongside a literature award now. So the fact that this series received 3 Eisner Awards is pretty good in itself. I think the writer, Brian K.Vaughan, he's won like a bunch of Eisner Awards over the course of his career, which is why we're probably going to come back to a lot of his comics as we go.
I mean, for reference, previous Eisner winning comics are Watchmen, The Killing Joke, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, Alan Moore's From Hell. He's in good company, isn't he?
Little side tidbit. I read there was some news today about the Watchmen TV show, and it just came out that Alan Moore was basically shitting on the TV show, and he's basically like, it's embarrassing. They asked me to be a part of it, blah blah blah, whatever.
I don't like it. I'm Alan Moore from Birmingham, and it makes me upset.
Yeah. The guy who thinks he's a wizard is like, this is embarrassing.
I never knew, because I've read so much Alan Moore stuff, and I didn't know what he looked or sounded like until I saw the advert for his masterclass, and it's like, I'm just going to teach you how to be a better writer. And you're like, fucking hell, is that Alan Moore? He looks mad.
The amazing thing about Alan Moore is he is easily one of the best comic book writers of all time.
Incredible.
Like, undeniably. He's an amazing talent. He's one of the best writers. I would put him one of the best writers of all time, regardless of medium. He's also one of the easiest people to take the piss out of.
He is, isn't he?
He's just so, like, every time it's like, I want nothing to do with it. Eddie, why are you remaking my comic book? Take my name off it. It's like, fucking just calm down, mate. Just collect like, who cares? Like,
he's more picky than Tolkien was.
Yeah, of course. And that's why, like, the latest news was that he just didn't like the new... He didn't even watch the new show. But that's the thing, is like that he knew of it and was just embarrassed by the concept. He's like, the fact that they did anything with his comic after he abandoned it. It's like finding out someone else, you abandoned your child and then someone else came and raised, and you're like, how dare you? That's embarrassing. I want nothing to do with that kid. And you're like, maybe that's a stretch. Maybe that's a stretch too far. But the main point is
comparing Alan Moore with parental abandonment.
Yeah, but of his comic books are his children.
Of his comic book child.
Yes. The main thing is, the story was he didn't like the new show. He found it embarrassing. And I was literally like, you could have given me the prompt for that news article, the title, and I could have guessed easily.
Do you think?
Alan Moore says something negative about remake of it. Like, anyone that would be like the worst, like, Mad Lib, guess the missing quote, kind of like, Alan Moore thinks blank about Watchmen remake. Like, is it shit or should never have been made?
Which is ironic, because his first really, really popular work was literally just a remake of Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, and that was his first one. I think, to be fair, he would have some kind of like, I was interested by this existing thing and had this interpretation of it.
Yeah, maybe. From Hell's pretty good. I like From Hell.
I have not read From Hell. It is one I need to read.
So good.
I would say my favourite Alan Moore title. I mean, Watchmen is the obvious answer. I really liked League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Yeah.
Original comic is
I like
really
V
amazing.
Vendetta as well.
V Vendetta is amazing as well, yeah. And we're all going to be covering these, but today
we're talking about something completely
we're doing
different.
Why the Last Man. And to be fair, like that whole thing, it lends credence to the Eisner Award thing. Like this comic book was so good that it won 3 of them. I think it's good to kind of check in as where the creators were at the time as well. So Brian K. Vaughan, the writer, I think I'm going to gravitate more towards writers because story to me is a bit more important than art, but I still see the value of art. Like it takes like great art to really get a comic book off the ground and express.
I mean, half of the medium is the visual storytelling.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think for me, the page layout is almost as important as the art.
For sure. Yeah.
Like panel layout, because that dictates the way a comic scans for me.
Panel layout's one of those really interesting things because it's hard to place who actually did what for that.
Yeah.
Because normally people, it's quite like writer writes a story, artist does the art, blah. But sometimes the writers, they literally will write just like a screenplay and then that gets adapted. And sometimes they write per panel. So let's say panel 1 this, panel 2 this. Sometimes they'll just number the panel. So they'll just say there's 6 on the page, do them however you want. And then some literally go panel here, top left quadrant, panel 2, top right quadrant. Like they'll literally like be like, this is exactly what you need to put in and how it fits. And this is the one pager, and
they'll fully storyboard it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you bring up that specifically because that's one thing where I think you need to almost know specifically who has done what on this.
Yeah.
So I don't have panel layout on this. So it could be Vaughan, it could be Guerra, but we'll see. But Vaughan is an interesting one here because when we were talking about superhero comics earlier, he had written for Marvel and DC.
Oh, had he?
Almost exclusively, I'd say, at least in terms of like professional or well-known stuff. He'd done Marvel and DC, did X-Men, Spider-Man, Captain America, and then for DC, like Batman and Green Lantern. He also did a bit of Buffy the Vampire Slayer comic for Dark Horse Comics. But apart from the Buffy one, the superhero ones are like the generic, like, are you a writer for Marvel or DC? Here's some titles.
Right,
have a go on each of them kind of thing. So, but it's interesting that he didn't have any massive credits before then. He was just kind of a staff writer and just churned out these ones. I've not heard of his runs of any of these. So
nothing special.
No, his biggest thing super-wise, it was after Y, was a series he created for Marvel called The Runaways.
Oh, yeah, I've read some of that.
And that's interesting as well because, again, even though it was a Marvel superhero comic, even then he had to have his interesting spin on it, which was that the children who were the stars were the children of supervillains.
Yeah.
And that's the premise. So even then, when he was doing his Marvel DC, like, big acclaimed run, he was still doing this, like, what would be an interesting way to look at, like, not just the characters but the entire Marvel world. So it was like these supervillains were like normal humdrum parents in their spare time,
and
but they're supervillains.
I think it's really interesting because that is a consistent theme in his work, this idea of running away from something. So you look at Yorick.
Yeah,
I think this is a nice segue into the book.
Yeah 100%. Well, good segue.
Thank you very much. Yorick is like consistently on the move, running away from something. Like there's always this external pressure on Yorick, isn't there?
Yes.
To be something or to be someone, and that's kind of part of his journey for me, is actually learning is learning what it is he actually wants to become. And I imagine that one of the reasons that he wrote a story where he took all the other men away is so that he could really explore what Yorick's masculinity meant to him in isolation.
And that's specifically running from masculinity almost and like responsibility. Just looking at his works, getting a bit ahead, but his works after Y, his big ones, obviously Runaways was one, and that was running away from the responsibility of like, you know, like the parents, the legacy the parents are instilling on their children and following in their footsteps and all that, and morality. He had a series post Y called Ex Machina, which is a fantastic series. One of his more underrated ones. Like people don't talk about as much as his other stories, but the plot of that is an ex-superhero becomes the mayor of New York.
Yeah.
And literally doesn't want to be a superhero anymore, but he's drawn back. So again, that's kind of like he's running away from what he was doing before and his call to arms and the way he was helping society versus now as a politician. And then after that was Saga, and that's literally two people running away from their species.
I mean, literally, Saga's really interesting. It's fascinating because it's so zeitgeisty when you think about it as two people who are literal refugees of war.
And chosen to be. Like, they ran away.
Absolutely. But they're two people who have been displaced due to war. And then they have this child that fits into neither culture, but that child wouldn't exist were it not for the war. They are war refugees. It's incredible, really. But just in space with boobies.
Oh yeah, lots of
so
tits
many
and
titties.
dicks and asses. There's a common theme, not beyond the sexual, but also the whole running away from responsibility. I think it just inherently makes for an interesting. It's that, you know, a story needs a resistance or something for the main character, the protagonist, to resist against.
Yes.
So in Brian K. Vaughan, he uses something societal for them to run away from in these really interesting ways. Before we forget as well, as I said, I do tend to gloss over the artists. I take for granted the art of comic books, I think.
Yeah.
So just to pay proper dues as well, Pia Guerra actually started off as a voiceover actor, worked on like video games and such.
Yeah.
And then apparently created storyboards for Boeing, Employees Credit Union, Microsoft Studios. Basically some like basic kind of like commercial artistic work kind of stuff. And then somehow, I don't have here exactly, but got into contact with Brian K. Vaughan and was like, hey, let's make a comic book together. And then they made Why the Last Man. So that's kind of crazy as well. First major project was Why the Last Man, co-created, and then various titles since, but definitely her big break as well. So
the nature of the story necessitated that most of the character models were female.
Exactly.
And so I think actually it made sense to have a female artist draw them. Because, you know, the male gaze on the female form is such that I don't think it would have been as good. And I don't like to generalise, but I don't think it would have been as good.
But then this comes back to the whole, how much autonomy does the artist have on any kind of given comic book?
Something I found really interesting, and I will find it for the show notes, is after I read Why, last time I read it, I was enjoying it so much that I read all of it, including all of the bits at the backs of the books. And I found a bunch of Pia Guerra's. I found a bunch of Pia's like iterations.
It's like stencils or pencilings.
Yeah, they're pencil drawings when they were developing the characters.
Yeah.
And I found the ones of 335. And 335 started off in, I don't know if it was Brian's original notes, as a white woman. But she landed as a black woman, firstly, but with less exaggerated female characteristics. And I think that suited her character so well, because 335 was this incredibly athletic, pragmatic character. And so I think actually, had it not been for Pia's iterations and characterization of her, she wouldn't have been as rich a character. And so I think actually, now that I think about it, just based on the iterations I saw of some of the character models, Pia's influence over the way the story went probably goes deeper than we thought it might have done.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like, when we can theorize and we can speculate, but we're never really going to know like which individual idea came from where. They have that somewhat with, like, it's interesting comparing to like films and such, because with films there's 100 credits and you know who exactly did what. Like, you've got the storyboards and everything. And it's interesting though, like with comic books, because it's such a limited thing, you don't know if like this idea come from this person, this character model, this characteristic or whatever. It's interesting you said about 355, because she definitely feels almost like of two worlds almost. And that's a common theme, I think, amongst some of the main female characters, because they were essentially brought up in a world of men, like the world we know now. But a lot of the female characters did adapt in their own ways, and 355 kind of feels almost like the positive masculinity aspect. She's tough. She, she's acting like she knows exactly what needs to be done at any moment. She's controlling of the situation. She's that saves the day most of the time. Like she's, that embodiment.
And so she carries some of the traits that would traditionally be associated with masculinity.
Exactly.
Yeah. And 335 is my favorite character.
She's fantastic.
Her arc, even over the first few volumes.
I would say before we get into that, I think if we do a kind of slow build, well, if we do in sections, and I think if we start off with like very generic of the story, kind of a plot summary, and also like a plot summary, characters, setting, that kind of thing, without giving any of the information. And then we'll get to like spoiler stuff as we go.
Okay.
One other thing before we get into that I just want to get across as well, what I found interesting is the publisher of the comic. And for all comics,
Image?
Vertigo. So Vertigo was basically an arm of DC Comics. And the reason it's interesting is it was their mature readers section. So it literally came back where like they had these stories that they did not, or basically couldn't be asked to run past what they called the Comics Code Authority.
So they made them for adults.
Exactly. So the problem they had before was comics. If you wanted to be approved, you had to be approved by the Comics Code Authority, and you had to be approved to be mass sold. But the problem was Comics Code Authority were a bunch of fascist assholes. Like the stuff they banned was ridiculous. Like it was that hype from like the 80s parents complaining about, rock music had like satanic messages and, Nixon and all that bollocks. So the Comics Code Authority, they just like completely was like wound down and just distilled everything to like the most blandest, basic, like don't, nothing too offensive, no blood, no violence, fair enough. But like character can't be like bad or do drugs because they might think they're bad.
Yeah, okay.
Like Stan Lee pushed for like an episode where he pushed for one of his characters to like become addicted to drugs because he wanted to do stories so that got the message about drug addiction out. And they were like, well, they have to be a bad person if they're addicted to drugs. And so I was like, well, no, that's not the point. Like, it has to be an empathetic character, like that kind of dumb stuff. But so DC apparently, and it was always going to happen. They were like, well, no one has to abide by the Comics Code Authority, but you need it to be mass sold. So they were like, there is an audience, a market for adult comics because they were being sold and created before the Comics Code Authority came in. So let's just make a title so it's very clear, adults only, mature, not for children. We don't need to check with the Comics Code Authority. And that started initially things like The Sandman, which did a lot of... Weird to think that's like kind of ethereal, dreamlike state, but they did a lot of like violence and dark stories as well. They also did Hellblazer, which is Constantine, depending on your pronunciation. But they started those kind of titles, and then that was in like early 90s. And then we come 10 years-ish later to Y: The Last Man. And what was interesting, especially as well, is they had their own comics under this band. So DC comics like Sandman and Hellblazer.
Yeah.
But then in the early noughties, they started doing creator-owned comics, and that's Y was one of the first of those. So if you write and do the art for the comic, you are the owners of the title, the intellectual property, everything.
Yeah.
And I think that especially appealed to Brian K.Vaughan because he came off of writing for Marvel and DC, where you are literally like, you are hired as a writer, you write for a bit, and then they bin you off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or they give you another title or whatever. And he was like, this was his first kind of passion project of his own. So that's why I think it's a good place to start with like these types of comics that aren't like serialized superhero ones. This is kind of embodiment of a creator being like, right, I'm going to do my own thing that I own. And it wasn't the first, but I think it's one of the biggest ones of the earliest.
Yeah.
So, because like people point to like Sandman and Hellblazer. I keep mentioning those. They're the two that I've got on my notes in front of me. But like those are like the Sandman is associated with Neil Gaiman. Like he, again, a big, well-known, revered comic writer, but their character's owned by DC. So despite Neil Gaiman making it what it is, he never owned the character. I think he owns it now. I don't know how. He finagled some way of like, I think they brought him back and he was like, look, give me the rights and I'll write you some more comics. I think he did something like that. But basically, yeah, this was the adults only arm of DC, which is why this is definitely a more adult themed comic.
Yeah, it's it deals with things like politics in a very knowing way, in a way that kind of presumes an age and level of education of its readers.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And they said it has to presume they are adults because it's meant to be an adults-only comic.
And I think, I think it's really interesting that they placed Yorick's mum in the White House.
So there's only so much we can get into without giving some of the story away, because the story changes from like issue 1. So as I said before, it's a disease that kills all the men, specifically all the Y chromosome mammals of the planet, except for the main character, Yorick Brown, and his monkey Ampersand. They start the issue right before the disease hits. So it's literally like the day of almost. But it gives you the setting, the characters, what they're doing just before it all hits, and then it hits. And then it's apocalypse almost from then on.
Oh, it's pure apocalyptic, isn't it?
Well, this is what I was literally just going to get into. It's interesting. You think of it as apocalyptic. It'd be apocalyptic if half of the population in any sense died. But then on the other side, you can also say, well, it's only half. But it's half because this is back in 2002, where even still today, most positions of power are occupied by men.
By somebody with a Y chromosome,
Exactly. Yeah. So the fact that they're all gone, you've then suddenly got this you've got the woman left behind who have to be like, what do we do now? How do we pick ourselves up from this? So it's what's good about the comic is how it's personalized to the individual stories of the characters, but by doing that, because of the positions of the characters, it tells the larger story of, especially mainly the country. It looks at the world a bit, but it's mainly of America as a country.
Oh, it's very America-centric, isn't it? Yorick leaves America twice.
Spoilers.
We can't. I don't. Are we going spoiler free? We haven't talked about this.
Well, okay. So if we start off with, as I said, the generic, if you were just describing it without giving anything away in terms of plot points post-apocalypse, shall we say. So the setting is where they are now. One point I was going to make was that it's the having Yorick's mum being I believe a senator.
She's a senator, yeah.
Senator. So she's got that front row. What is the top of the country? How are they reacting? How are they dealing with everything? And I think it's kind of a cheat code in a sense for something like this. Put someone in a position of power, then you see how the power reacts to this devastation.
And he did it with both of the female members of Yorick's family, because he placed Hero, Yorick's sister, as an EMT. And so
she's kind of grounds, even though everywhere is ground zero, she's especially at ground zero.
Yeah, so you see how two different aspects of the institution react to this apocalypse level threat. And it's very, very quickly. Are we allowed spoilers yet? Are we allowed to get into it yet?
Well, I'll make a few points just about the setting, and I think generally the writing. The writing is, again, one of my favorites of any comic. And Brian K.Vaughan is one of my favorite comic writers, and I think that really comes across in how the dialogue exposition. I'm always whenever I watch anything like film, TV, anything, I'm always very kind of when someone gives information in a heavy-handed way, where you can see the writer being pay attention to this tidbit of information, it's going to come important later. Or they're just getting across God, I can't believe I have to deal with this on a Monday on a 9 a.m. in the office, and you're okay, so I know where you are, what the time is, what the day, that kind of stuff. I feel like this dialogue gets across the exposition in such a great way. Yeah,
his dialogue's really naturalistic. I remember there's that scene really early on, isn't there, where Yorick there's a Mexican standoff outside the White House with the wives of the Republican politicians.
Yes.
And the remaining Democrat politicians, because surprise, surprise in America, there's more female Democrats than there are Republicans. And Yorick's mum steps out, and he's done something clever there. He's made a clever observation about the political makeup of America, but we get that through exposition with his mum. And I think that's really interesting. And it is his dialogue writing is pleasant.
not just his dialogue, but also how his assumptions on what the world would be like after the disease happens. It's either that would probably happen, or it's a commentary on our world now. So like the fact that the Republican wives are like, well, we should get our husbands seats. And the women Democrats who were actually voted in are like, well, no, it doesn't work like that. We're not going to change the rules just because of this happening. So stuff like that, I think, is such amazing writing. The dialogue that comes in very handy as well, with like little things like male characters incorrectly referring to female characters their titles incorrectly. So on the one hand, you show the ignorance of men generally, but you also have the women correcting them, and then that's like, oh, like Yorick's mum, someone calls her something else, she goes, actually it's senator. And then you go, she is a senator. They call it
it's one of the senators calls her congresswoman.
Exactly. So it's very clever dialogue exposition is what I'm in a really roundabout way trying to get across. One thing that's interesting as well is the something you brought up before we actually properly got into this.
Bechdel test.
The Bechdel test.
For anyone who doesn't know what the Bechdel test is, the Bechdel test was established by Alison Bechdel, actually in a comic strip. It comes from a comic strip. And it's a way of judging any piece of media. All you need to pass the Bechdel test is to have two female characters have a conversation about something other than a man. I looked this up before we started today.
Okay.
I would like to give you a list of some current films that did not pass the Bechdel test.
If you say Schindler's List, I'm going to flip this table over.
Dude, do you know what? I want to say that Schindler's List probably does.
It does. Well, no, it's a male prison. Like it all entirely takes place in a male prison. So obviously it wasn't going to.
Schindler's List?
Sorry, I'm thinking of the prison one. God damn it. This is why we're not a film podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hang on. What's the what's the prison one? Stephen King.
Do you mean
Morgan Freeman?
The prison one.
The fact that you can't think of it as well is indicative. Is it because you keep thinking Schindler's List?
Yeah, no, it's because I keep
Shawshank.
Redemption.
I got Shawshank and Schindler mixed up.
I was going to say, because there's the little red dress at the end of Schindler's List, and that's like the most heart-wrenching moment.
Yeah. Shawshank Redemption is the one that doesn't pass the Bechdel test for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
It's the one that's used as like the example of just like, the Bechdel test is important, but it's not the be-all, end-all.
Yeah. But Lightyear didn't pass the Bechdel test. Neither did the new Despicable Me film.
Do Minions have genders?
Well, this is the thing. He has 3 daughters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they should have. They definitely should have.
At some point in that hour-and-a-half film for children, they could have had a conversation about something other than a man.
Yeah.
And I thought that why wouldn't pass the Bechdel test?
Yeah, I was surprised when you first made that assumption, because then on the first issue I found the example of it.
Well, yeah, and this is the thing, you found the example but you didn't tell me what it was.
So I've got it here.
I've been waiting.
So in the first issue, it passes because there's a conversation between 355 and Dr. Frozun Hamad.
Is that about the amulet of Helene?
It's about the amulet, and it's about so there's a bit of a. I was gonna get your opinion on this, right? They don't talk about a man specifically, but they do talk about the men in the country they're in and how the doctor is there. I can't remember the reason she was there, but she was there for some kind of women's rights related thing, and the men were oppressing the women in that country. So it's I would say it counts because it's not about a male character.
It is about men in general.
It's about men in general, but then you could be like, if 2 women were talking about sports, if they were talking about like football, you wouldn't be like, well, was it men's football? Doesn't count then. Like, I think 2 women having a conversation about football is better than women just talking about the male character in the story.
Yeah, I think so.
I would say to me that counts, and I think there's a lot of instances of that count of other examples, but I can also understand why there's not as many as you might think, because there's a male protagonist who is the center of the story.
Yeah, and isn't that funny though? He kills all the men but one, and he still manages to put one of them at the center of his story.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I saw a review of the TV show, and I was always going to have a copy of it here, and I just forgot. But there was a woman in The Guardian. She did not like the new Why, the TV show.
Right.
But a lot of why she didn't like it was the story. So essentially, it counts towards the comic as well. But she also makes a point of being like, yeah, the Americans have just overturned Roe v. Wade. I'm not the most pro-man mood right now. And then she basically is like, this man-baby main character who I hate.
Right, okay.
Yeah. And I'm like, I'm literally reading her review like, I understand where you're coming from. You probably should not have reviewed. It's difficult. It's like, she admits her bias, and I'm like, absolutely fair enough. I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
But also at that point in time, when the show came out, a lot of women were probably going to have that. They were probably going to share that bias.
Yeah.
So then what I was about to say, which I caught myself for, was like, maybe a man should have reviewed it, which is the worst. When you're so woke, you go all the way around to sex.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've gone too far.
It meets up around the back. It's like a Mobius strip.
Exactly. So I just thought it was interesting, and as I appreciate that she said put her biases on the front.
Yeah.
She didn't like the story. She didn't like there was a main character who, I think this is a good point to get into, is the main character is not the opposite of masculinity, but he's definitely like a poster child for arrested development of men who haven't quite become men in the eyes of society and that kind of thing.
Yeah, Yorick is, and I think this is one of the things that Brian K. Vaughan was working through when he was writing it, was actually on the cusp of true adulthood. So not the point where we are told we need to be adults. Like you hit 18 or 21 and it's like, you're an adult now, you need to be able to do X, Y, Z.
In the 50s.
Yeah,
like, you're an adult now, you're going to have a wife and kids and a midlife crisis in a couple of years.
Yeah, and a Cadillac and a house in the suburbs. But it's that point at which you are a self-reliant person. And Yorick wasn't quite there yet.
I mean, he was at the point when the disease hits, he's professional escape artist?
He's an unemployed escape artist.
When, the escape artist industry are famously always not hiring.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, very rarely.
We can never keep someone locked down.
I knew it. I knew you were going to say it. I knew you were going to go there. I knew it.
We always try and keep people in the role. And
low-hanging fruit.
Fantastic. This is the Jokes Podcast. Thank you for attending. I do think one thing is interesting is there's on the dual purpose, him being an escape artist is not only a metaphor for, again, him running away, escaping responsibility, but it also is such an amazing cheat code for having a character who constantly gets out of situations.
Yeah, it's a Deus Ex Machina for him a lot, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's what I was saying about his mum being the congresswoman. There's so many things, like Brian K. was like this really clever, like sets up these like what they call like the a series of like a dominoes kind of thing that leads into like a bigger, but he sets up all the pieces at the beginning and then he's like, oh, she's a congresswoman, that's why we know what this is happening at the White House, and he's an escape artist, so he had a key in his liver or something.
Yeah, he swallowed a key, and he starts using that straight away.
Yeah, exactly.
Because he gets locked in the
freezer. Oh no, the safe of the White House.
It was the bomb shelter that they'd put in there for, which one was married to Nancy?
Reagan.
Yeah. The bomb shelter they put in there with Reagan with the good lock so that he wouldn't wander out because he was riddled.
Yeah. Great joke. Also, any escape artist getting out of a White House bomb shelter. Like, that might have been pushing my suspense of disbelief for a bit there.
Do you think?
A little bit. I mean, I can't remember. He got out some clever way. But now, in the moment, you're kind of like, oh, that's clever. And then later, you're kind of like, was that clever or was that bollocks?
He worked out that if Nancy Reagan had dropped her joint and started a fire, would there just be an alarm that rang somewhere or would the door pop open?
That's, yeah.
And so he set a fire and the door popped open.
But also, that's like relying on American ingenuity. It's like, if he sets fire to it, it's like, oh, they didn't think of that. And now I'm just going to burn.
And now I'm going to die in an inferno.
Yeah. But again, that's that clever story writing that, just kind of works in this scenario.
But I do think it's really interesting that you talk about Yorick and his Arrested Development, because he does he has a particular type of ineptitude. Like,
but it's like he's chosen to be like, he's very talented, a person, very resourceful, but he's never applied himself. And that's the very famous, like, man-child epidemic of that kind of generation.
Have you ever heard of learned helplessness?
No, but I think I can intuit that it's people basically choosing not to be resourceful or...
So learned helplessness is fascinating. A really good way of testing it is that you take two groups of people and you give them each a set of anagrams to solve.
I'm terrible at anagrams, so I'm scared where this is going.
You're fucked then.
Right.
So the first group have 3 anagrams, all 3 of which are relatively easy to solve. The third group have 3 anagrams, the first 2 of which are completely unsolvable. The third one is the same third one that the first group had. And what you'll find is that the first group will solve the 2 easy ones and then move on to the third one, which is more challenging, but eventually solve it. The group that had the 2 unsolvable ones to start with won't solve the third one because they have learned helplessness.
Right.
Because they've tried something twice, it's not worked. So by the time they've gotten to the third one, they're just completely unable to solve it. And that is absolutely where Yorick had gotten to at the start of the book. He's doing his amazing Yorick routine because he is fucked up another job interview. He's not getting a job. He's not able to pay his rent. He's in this cycle of learned helplessness. And that's such an interesting character to set up as your hero.
I will say I agree with most of what you say, but if you gave me 3 anagrams and the first 2 were unsolvable, fuck am I attempting the third one?
It's learned helplessness, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was like, whoop, you guess you don't have the stuff to make it in the world. It's like, well, nah, it's just anagrams, mate. Just, like...
No, it's just human nature. It's just the way we're built.
That makes more sense.
Yeah, it's not a suggestion that some people are weak and they can't solve the third one. It's that,
or they're just they don't think to bother trying on.
It's human nature.
Yeah,
and so you've got a character that at the point where he discovers he is the last man on Earth, he is at that point of learned helplessness. Like he has failed over and over again.
There's an interesting comment as well on that, as I said, that generation of the man-child who...
Kind of our generation.
Exactly.
Older millennials.
That never had to strive for anything. And I think people will have all their different opinions on why that is. Some people say, like, they didn't have, like, a war or anything to have to rise up to.
They did, though.
Well, I think there's a lot of different factors. I think the main one for me, if I was to make a guess, is that there was just less... requirement for men to be the breadwinner and the earner and the that kind of thing. And that's not to say like that sounds like it could go into an anti-feminist kind of like the women want equality, but I don't mean that at all.
You're getting a little.
But I think there's a growing pains when it comes to equality that a lot of men just didn't have these roles to fulfill anymore. And were just kind of at a loss because they weren't pushed into those things like they would have been previously. Does that make sense?
Like men needed a template to fit, and then that template was gone.
Without the societal expectation to achieve, you had a lot of men who just didn't. And they wouldn't have if that expectation had never been there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think he's a good representation of that. But because we empathize with him at that point, and then when he rises to the challenges as he goes on, we empathize with that as well, because that becomes the whole protagonist. Like, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And I think I agree with you that it's such a good character to have in this kind of role.
Yeah, and he went to great lengths to emasculate Yorick.
Yes.
Like, there is a running joke in why. I don't know if you've ever clocked it.
I mean, go. If it's not a spoiler, go ahead.
Yorick has a tiny penis.
I did not clock that at all, no.
Yeah, Yorick has a small dick.
Do we... Well, so we don't see it, obviously.
No, but so many women go for it during the story because they're like, you're not a man. Oh, and there's a bunch of times where people are like... One woman grabs his dick and goes, you are a man, but just barely. Like, there's a whole bunch of times where it's implied that Yorick has a really small penis.
But also, could be grower, not shower.
It could be in fairness, he is very committed to monogamy.
Exactly.
Like, he is deeply committed to monogamy as a character, isn't he?
I think that's a very interesting aspect, a choice in the character as well, is having a character who is committed to his girlfriend. And obviously, see how that goes as the series goes on and everything. No spoilers. But it's interesting that, like, the stereotype fantasy of, like, if you were the last man on Earth and imagining men just like, I'm gonna have so much sex. Like, I think it was a good way to shake things up by having him committed to his girlfriend, and he's trying to. So one of the story beats as it goes on is they're not only trying to find the cure in him to hopefully have more men created in the future, but he's trying to find his girlfriend, who at the time of the disease was in Australia.
Yes.
And they were long distance. So I think it was interesting. I think it was a good way to avoid like a almost like B porn plot kind of thing, where, because if he was single, it would have been like you can imagine it veering into like, I've got to repopulate the earth kind of bollocks. Whereas him being committed, it kind of not only gave him a goal, but also it kind of streamlined the story a bit.
And it created tension between him and the Doctor.
Yes.
And 335.
And also, great reference to the Doctor, who I found very interesting that she is Dr. Man. And that's such like an on-the-nose, almost a nothing reference, but it's just like an interesting, like...
It's a name that she chose as well.
Yes, yeah.
She makes it very clear that she chose that name to westernize herself.
Yes. But also, in choosing it, she inadvertently chose to... Her version of westernizing was also the most masculine name possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Short of like Mr. Cox or something, you know.
Yeah.
But I thought that was just like enough to, you know, enough to at least reference. One of my favorite aspects of the story and the world at large is the Amazons, because to me they kind of represent how the story is interesting, because you imagine if all the men died, I think especially a lot of like sexist men would have this idea of like, oh, the woman would be helpless, they couldn't do anything, or, you know, how the woman would be, that they would all turn lesbian, or that, you know, all these assumptions, whatever. And everyone can have their opinion on whatever, how women would react to this. I think what's great about this and how Brian K.Vaughan is he has every possible reaction. So whatever possible reaction a woman could have, there's a group or an individual, they've all, across the board, they all happen.
Which is absolutely the way it would go. I would like to know that what actually turned all of the women lesbian was being at home with their husbands for a year during the pandemic.
Oh, for sure. 100%, yeah.
And I use the word turned really loosely there because I know
Discovered.
That's not how it works.
They rediscovered themselves.
A bunch of women were stuck at home with their husbands and came out on the other side of it and went, didn't realise I was fucking gay.
Till I had literally no other options. But yeah, and the Amazons, I think, are such a interesting, like they're the hardcore.
Oh, it's
misandrist. Is that the man hating? Yeah. The extreme misandrist reaction to thinking that the disease was God's will, and not only are they glad the men are dead, but anything even close to man has to be eliminated as well.
What I find fascinating about them is that he uses it as an opportunity. I'm going to delve into spoilers. I can't...
All right, let me just, I'll just wrap up any other pre-spoiler notes I have before we get into that.
Okay.
I love the building of antagonists as we go on. That'll be kind of more spoiler, but like he builds antagonists so well to kind of keep causing problems for them. Vaughan also is really good at making the opposite to whatever you expect happen. So I think there's a constant thing, and that's kind of a spoiler in itself. But I love the, like, you constantly get to points where you go, well, obviously this is going to happen. And then he just makes the opposite happen. But he somehow manages to keep the story going with that, which is the hardest part. Because, like, famous example, there's, I say famous, a niche example. You know, Kevin Smith, the director.
I'm aware of Kevin Smith.
When he made Red State, and that was a religious thing, he said he tried to do that with the story. And it's these religious people who think that the end of the world is coming, and they're basically sacrificing the unworthy in God's name and all that. And he does all these opposite things, and spoilers for Red State, kills off like the protagonists and as he goes, and the people you thought were going to live die and all that. And he gets to the end of the film, and he said while he was writing, he was like, he had to call his friend up. He's like, I'll fucking rip myself into a corner here. And he's like, why? He's like, well, at the point where I've written myself now, by trying to beat expectations, either nothing happens or the end of the world happens. Like, it has to be the rapture. The rapture happens. And then in the film, nothing happens. It literally is like a damp squib ending.
Yeah.
But when he was talking to his friend, and he was like, I can't do the rapture. Like, I'm going to have to do the nothing ending. And his friend was like, Spielberg would have done the rapture.
What a cunt.
But it was such an interesting, like, you've got nowhere else to go. And I think it's a credit to Vaughan that how he gets that way.
Yeah. Although I sometimes feel that stuff feels a bit authored. Whereas, like, he's a big fan of the Deus Ex Machina.
Yes.
Like,
but he makes his own. So a proper Deus Ex Machina comes out of nowhere or is an incredible coincidence.
Yeah.
He lays the seeds for his reveals or saves later on. So at least he's making them in advance. The only issue is if you're kind of more savvy story reader, comic reader, TV, film, whatever. If you're savvy enough, you kind of see them early on. So by making them not come out of nowhere, you see them and you go, okay, that's going to happen. That's going to do this for later, that kind of thing. But yeah, he's very good at that sort of thing. The only other thing is he also, because of the issue formatting, he's very good at the cliffhanger reveals. But again, that's down to the formatting, because it would be a monthly issue and then the next issue would have to like hype you up for the next month's issue and be like, don't forget, like next month we're gonna answer this big cliffhanger. But when you read it as one go, it's like 20 pages cliffhanger, 20 pages cliffhanger, 20. So it's, you see that as it goes. But I think it's good kind of how he does it. So yeah, non-spoiler. I think that's all the non-spoiler stuff. We're now going to get into the details of just, I'd say, the first half of the entire run. So this is the first, the first 5 volumes is what I kind of got to, which I think we'll just cover if we even get that far.
The Amazons.
The Amazons. What I love about the Amazons is how you hear them as a rumor at the start, and then they could be real.
They're this insidious force.
Yes, and specifically the cutting off of one of their breasts to better fire arrows.
It's great.
It's one of the most metal things, and it's such like the opposite of like the helpless woman. Like we don't know what to do. All the men going. The woman's just like, I've just cut my right tit off. Like I'm ready to go.
I've cut my tit off and I'm shooting a bow and arrow from the back of a motorbike.
Exactly. It's hardcore. There's such a great enemy for right at the beginning, because they're just like an ideological enemy. So you haven't like built up any of the kind of nitty gritty of like the finding the cure and the other characters and stuff. So this is like from the base, like this is how they've reacted to the disease, and they want to kill Yorick for obvious reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. They're fascinating. The thing that I find most interesting about them is that it gave him a way to talk about something really zeitgeisty, because extremism, and particularly the deprogramming of extremists, was a really prevalent, relevant topic in 2002.
Yes.
A year after 9/11.
Post 9/11, yeah.
Post 9/11, he is straight in there talking about the methods of extremism and the way that a common enemy or a scapegoat can be used to mobilize a brainwashed masses. And I think that's so interesting, because that is something that would have been at the very core of the American consciousness at the time.
100%, yeah.
This idea of extremism and the rise of extremism was so prevalent. You look at any media coming out of America in the early noughties, you can't help but talk about 9/11, and this was his way of talking about 9/11 without actually doing it.
And what's very interesting, slightly off topic, is his comic run after this, Ex Machina. The plot of that is the superhero who becomes Mayor of New York. Spoilers for Ex Machina. He becomes mayor because he saves one of the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
And that's like the whole political, like, well, of course you're going to vote for the guy who stopped half of 9/11.
But it's just so interesting. And this, like the way that you watch, what's her name? The one with the red hair.
Victoria.
The way you watch Victoria, program Hero.
It's really good. It was all my notes as well. Yeah,
It's fact, she'll say things like, "Oh, I don't want to bark orders at you like a patriarch."
yeah,
And that whole speech about the Queen in chess. It's fascinating, and it is absolutely the way that an extremist would brainwash the masses. It's textbook stuff. It's the way that fascist governments worked. You would take a scapegoat and then you would align yourself in opposition to it and use that to rouse the masses. And that's fucking fascinating to me. And he gave such a great portrayal of it. And again, I don't want to bring gender into it too much, but I think it's really difficult not to bring gender into it.
Of this comic, it's going to be.
Generally, those figures would be male.
Yeah.
And yet Victoria was so strongly focused on femininity and the importance of femininity that it just makes her this really fascinating character. And then by proxy, Hero is this really interesting character.
So this was what I was saying about antagonists, is Victoria being the first antagonist.
Yeah.
Is such a good use of like the enemy almost being the current situation. She's like representative of the most extreme
absolutely.
of the current situation. Great brainwashing. She knows when to like be soft and be comforting and then be hard and strict and everything. Hero is like the one being brainwashed and a good example of that. And what's especially I thought was very noteworthy is I love her monologue about the
word cunt.
Yeah, the word cunt, because I think it was just a really good, interesting point of some woman in the scenario is like, "Oh, I hate that word" or something. She has like a reaction to it, and Victoria's
calls one of the women that they take a motorcycle back off of.
That's it.
Calls her a cunt, and she says, "Why do you think that's an only in America would we make the name for our genitals an insult? Actually, in Britain, that's a perfectly harmless word." And I think that's so interesting. Yeah, no, it's...
Well, the point, she especially makes is that the reason that cunt, and this is where we become this is the sweary podcast now. Like we're doing the swear.
We've said the word cunt 5 times in a row.
I think you said it right at the top. So anyone who's still listening now, you know what you got into.
Do you know what the problem is, though? It just means that we're only going to have listeners in America, in Britain and Australia.
I think there's some in America who are who don't as much of an issue with it.
I used the word cunt in America recently.
And everyone stopped.
Well, we'd walked like 3 city blocks in New York next to this woman, and she heard me say the word cunt, and I referred to myself as a silly cunt. I was like, I couldn't find someone. I was like, "Oh, you fucking silly cunt," which is a perfectly normal thing for a British person to do. And she turned 180 degrees and walked in the opposite direction because I had the audacity to swear in her presence.
To be fair, if you didn't have the accent, you probably would have had a go. It's only the accent's like, these foreigners, they don't know better. That's how we get away with it.
Absolutely.
But I thought what was an interesting point was that she not only references how old the word is, but specifically that it's only the word, not the only word, but the word that's considered the most offensive and the least using in polite society that's not like a racial slur connotation or anything else. It's the one for female genitalia, and that no word for male genitalia even comes close. Like you can say every other word for dick, and no one will bat an eyelid. But as soon as you say cunt, it's record scratch. Everything stops.
Yes.
And I thought that was a really interesting point because as soon as I read it, I was like, yeah, that is true. Like
it's absolutely
that
true.
makes sense.
And I think
you can imagine a bunch of men being like, "Oh, don't bring that up. We're at the dinner table," but we'll say like cock and ass or whatever. Absolutely fine.
We will talk about our cocks all day, and we will, get drunk and swing them about or whatever.
I'll talk about my cock while eating a spotted dick. But if you even suggest vagina at the dinner table, I will throw up.
Yeah, just violently vomit instantly.
Exactly.
Disgusting.
So, but yeah, that was definitely a very good point of Brian to make.
So, how do you feel about? Because one of the things that I found jarring on my second reading, so not the first time I read it, but when I went back to it before we did this, was how quickly Hero took to the brainwashing and how easy it was for Victoria to program her.
Well, they explain that, don't they? So after a while, they explain that it was kind of living in Yorick's shadow, that
that did it.
That laid the groundwork for her to be susceptible to this extreme situation later.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like she was always this way, but obviously Victoria had this kind of thing of seeing what was in women that she could appeal to and bring them over. And specifically in Hero, having a father that was a bit neglectful in a kind of, I think if I remember correctly, he would, educate them quite a bit, but he wasn't very warm and loving.
Yeah.
But he was also more focused on Yorick and his achievements. And that comes about, there's a standoff where Yorick uses an incorrect version of the phrase, we've crossed the Rubicon.
You've crossed the Rubicon now.
And Hero has to be like, no, it's crossed the Rubicon, as opposed to whatever he said incorrectly.
He said you passed the fucking Rubicon,
That's
and she said, no, you've crossed the Rubicon.
And she makes a point of, their dad always, taught them all this stuff, and Yorick barely paid attention, but she knew it all, but Dad didn't care that she knew it all. And so that's the kind of explanation. And that, I think, that's one example of Vaughan's like character building and explanations later on.
Yeah.
There's a great one, my favorite character explanation for actions at the very end, which I can't say, but when you get to the very last issue, there's a great reveal of like, this is why this character's been like this. But obviously we won't get into that. But one thing that I do think is interesting, I love this entire comic. There's one storyline I don't like.
Ooh, which one?
That is the one with the BDSM, the woman who has to look after Yorick while 355 and Man do something else.
Yeah.
And she basically
773.
Yeah. She ties him up, and she it turns into this weird psychosexual fever dream of like it just gets really weird. And
I really like that one.
See, my only issue is there's a great point at the end of why all that's happening.
Yeah.
But the point, for me, it doesn't justify the means. So
yeah.
The point of that story is, so this is very clever. In the stories leading up to that, Yorick is constantly putting himself in harm's way to
suicidal, isn't it?
Yeah, but to the benefit of the story. So 355 tells him, wait over here, don't come out. And then 355 gets stuck in some situation.
He'll just jump out and start punching people.
Yorick comes out, makes a distraction, saves the day. And she's like, well, thanks for saving me, but I did tell you to wait here. And that, I noticed that the first couple of issues while on my second read and went, yeah, that's kind of getting a bit samey. Like that formula keeps getting used. And then we get to this issue, and it, without realizing, it addresses that exactly.
Oh, because she treats him. Yeah, she treats his suicidal.
Exactly. So through this weird BDSM, psychosexual, whatever, it gets to a point where she's like, you want to die, but you're too cowardly to do it yourself. So you're putting yourself in harm's way in the hopes that you die. And he's like, yeah. And then it becomes that realization. So I'm removing a cat. That realization is what it becomes the way to mend that, and for him to do better and actually address the situation.
Very typical of the way we still considered mental health in 2002.
Exactly. I mean, use sex to solve everything, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, like one very weird sexual experience can cure years worth of mental trauma.
Yes. But my thing was, I didn't think any of the other shit to get there was necessary, or I think it was like to an end to a means of just like, whoa, he's tied up and she's got a knife, and whoa, this is crazy. And then it's like, oh, turns out we're addressing this character flaw. And I was like,
because hadn't 335 asked her to do that?
Apparently not.
No.
So apparently Yorick's like, oh, did 355 ask you to do this? And I think she's like, no, but she told me that you keep getting into these scenarios.
Yeah.
And this is what I do. And it was also very kind of like, I was just praising Vaughan for his setting up of characters and situations, but then it turned into like, they happened to run into she was nearby and she specialized in this kind of, again, kind of coming into the brainwashing, but it's almost like a self-brainwashing almost.
Yeah.
But I was praising him for that before, and then that one didn't quite hit for me. And it's a delicate balance of setting up stuff and paying it off later without it coming off as contrived.
I don't necessarily like some of his ancillary characters that much.
That's fair. I mean, with enough characters, there's going to be differences.
Yeah, and there are a lot of characters that come in and out of focus for an issue at a time and that we never see again. I think this is really interesting because it's a man writing a lot of women. And I think if this was being written now, actually, it would be #problematic for one man to write that many female characters. Some of them are really good. Some of them are really interesting, like the new Beth.
Yes, very interesting.
The Beth that he meets, who has that amazing kind of theological knowledge and her own way of processing her Catholic guilt. I think she's a really well-rounded, interesting character.
But also, that might be because she's almost mirroring Yorick, and that leads to the spoiler of him having sex with this woman who's not his girlfriend.
Yes.
Because all the opportunities he had previously, she presents like a mirror image of him almost.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, she's interesting. I think the prison colony issue has a lot of well-rounded characters. I really like the old woman. Do you remember?
She's great. The ex-cons.
Yeah,
that's a great story.
They stumble upon a village entirely populated by the occupants of a female prison who got released as the disease hit. And one of them is an old woman who is a murderer. She killed her husband. And she is this, by turns, bitter, world-worn, but ultimately very warm character. She is kind without being nice.
Exactly.
She is deeply unpleasant towards Yorick, but pays him a kindness. And at the very end, she says...
She's firm but fair.
Yeah, at the very end, she says, oh, he's a sanctimonious shit, but he doesn't deserve to die. And I think that's beautiful because he had just been proselytizing about the fact that she fucking well did deserve to die. And so, yeah, there are times when he writes these really well-rounded characters, and then times where some of them fall flat for me.
I think when he has such a variety of characters and they all are so interesting and complex, some are going to hit and some are going to miss. I think that's just for any reader. I think what really helps is because of the variety, you are going to have those ones you like and those ones that you don't like. Like, I guess by proxy, I'm not as much of a fan of the other Culper Ring. That's the secret organization that 355 is a part of. That other Culper Ring agent, because I didn't like the story she was a part of.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't mind the character as such, but I guess I negatively equate that story to her, so...
How do you feel about the Culper Ring thing?
I think it's another means to an end. You have to have you have to have an extremely capable woman to guide Yorick, because he's not the slacker man-child. It has to be of the highest ranking, so it had to be like CIA or FBI or something like that. Yeah. The Culper Ring being a secret government organization was just more interesting, adds a little bit of mystery, which helps the story. I think good overall. And as you said, 355, amazing character. Love her character arc and everything as it goes.
Can we get into 355? Because I think one thing I think is really interesting is that she, in Pia's original sketches, she didn't start out as a black woman. She starts out as a white woman. And as Pia's drawing iterations of her, you gradually see black features come in. Her nose gets broader, her hair gets... She starts drawing her... I think she started drawing her with more black facial features and then eventually started drawing her with natural hair. And so her blackness wasn't a part of Brian's original characterization for the character. Because if not, she would have just already started drawing a black woman.
Yeah.
And I think it's... And I think it's cool.
I think there's possibility to read into some kind of like masculinity being associated with the race as well as gender, but then like in TV and film and popular media, you see a lot of black women who are given more to do and more to deal with, more autonomy sometimes more than white women. Like,
well, it's the trope of the angry black woman, isn't
exactly.
it? And I think that's dangerous because 335 was not that.
No, she was incredibly capable. I don't think she rarely ever was angry, but I think it is a misplaced idea of masculinity which gets cross-referenced with race when it shouldn't be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and intersectionality is probably an idea that was only just beginning to exist in 2002.
Oh, for sure. And the fact that there's a good example of the fact of how few trans characters there are in the original comic, but then they put some in the TV show.
And trans stuff is dealt with fucking horrifically.
Yes, exactly.
You hear any trans man in the book is just referred to as a tranny.
Yes. And
the trans masculinity is invalidated consistently.
Yes.
Throughout the book.
And the language across the board, like all language that you could consider like non-PC or cancelable or whatever, it's rife in this because it's of its time of 2002.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to note that actually, whilst I really like it, I view the kind of inherent, I don't know that I'd call it transphobia, but the poor representation of trans people in it.
We should probably make across right now that we are two white, straight, cis males.
I am the token white cis het man.
Yes. So these are the opinions are worth whatever they're worth from the people they're coming from.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because trans masculinity in this, like actually having a stronger conception of trans masculinity would have made for a more interesting story. I think the idea of having trans men exist in this world to the extent that they would if it happened in 2022, not 2002, would have made for a richer, more interesting story.
100%, yeah.
But people just weren't there yet with the way they understood transgender people.
And you can also put down to, like, if I'm going to equate the quality of the writing to the writer, then I'm also going to say that the writer probably didn't have the information or the experience to include that. Like, it's saying that if someone didn't have like the ideas to put like fleshed out trans issues and characters into a story, it's probably because the person at the time didn't have them. And that's like, it's you can put it down to ignorance and maybe a sign of the wider times rather than like an individual like choice not to. If they didn't even realize the choice was there.
It's so interesting because I don't think it's a failing of the writers, but it's hard not to view things in retrospect.
100%. And you can only look at it at the light that you have now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an ongoing discussion I've been having with people at the moment about the cancel culture more widely and the way that we as a society respond to things that no longer exist in their original historical context. Really good conversation I was having recently was about Eminem. And it's that same thing of actually his work is really fucking homophobic. But seen in the context of a rapper in the early noughties, it was perfectly acceptable. And so do we go back and edit those things out of our cultural discourse? Or do we enjoy them with the caveat that actually you can look at certain elements of these things and say, I find that really problematic, but that's because with the rest of us, I've done the work to have a richer understanding of LGBTQIA plus issues or trans issues. You know, do we take something like this and abstract it from its original context and then view it through our modern lens? Or do we take it and say, well, no, we have to look at it within the context of what was culturally acceptable 20 years ago, 2 decades ago when it was written?
This is going to sound like a bit of a cop-out answer for me, but I also think it is the truth. I think it's both. I think it's...
Yeah, I agree.
You have to look at it in today's lens. Like, there's language in the comic that I'm not going to start using now because I'm going to cite the comic like, look, see, they said it in this that came out in 2002.
Yeah.
So I'm not... It's... None of that's going to...
None of that's 20 years ago.
Exactly. So none of that's going to inform me, but I'm also not going to hold its feet to the fire like if a comic was released today that had the same language. If a comic was released today and had the language from Y: The Last Man, I'd be like, you're a fucking idiot because you know better, or you should know better. People in 2002 should have known better, but they didn't. We know they didn't because we've had to make strides as a society since 2002. So you equate the person of the time and you say they wrote it because it's like this at the time.
And I think to keep going with it, because I think it's an interesting thing to think about, it's more relevant to a discussion about why than it is other media.
Yeah.
Really good example is Ace Ventura: Pet Detective.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're gonna. Yeah.
If anybody doesn't,
I will go so far. I like that film. That is transphobic.
Yeah, straight up. If you don't know what it is, pause, Google Ace Ventura trans. You will find the scene. But it's fucking transphobic and it's jarring.
Yeah.
But it's in the middle of a Jim Carrey comedy. Whereas why is, at its very core, a rumination about the importance of gender.
Yes, and I'm more forgiving to why because it's portraying characters as they are. They're not all meant to be liked all the time.
Yeah,
even
Yorick certainly isn't.
No, exactly. And that's the difference, like Ace Ventura being meant to be a comedy, you're meant to just laugh along. So when people are laughing along to the transphobic jokes, that is inherently harmful.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, one of my most common examples is a show like Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where the characters are explicitly meant to be the worst people that you've ever met.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when they do and say bad stuff, you are meant to be like, that is bad because they are bad people who are doing it.
You are laughing at them, not the butt of the joke.
Exactly.
They are the butt of the joke.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And I think, again, in a wider conversation about comedy, it's about not punching down, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And it's relying on the audience being savvy enough to know who the butt of the joke is.
Yeah.
And some people think that if certain language is used, the person of the language, the people that the language is aimed at must be the butt of the joke. It's like, no, the person using the language is the butt of the joke because we all have agreed that you shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
And they are ignorant of this.
And I suppose this is the thing. There wasn't a cultural norm that had been set yet that stated that we had an understanding of trans people.
Exactly.
But I still find that binary conception of gender that is like a central observation of the book to be a little bit jarring now.
Yes, and it is completely of its time, and I would go so far as to say outdated, for sure.
Yeah, it dates it. This is the thing, it dates it.
Definitely.
It absolutely dates it. And I don't know where I'm going with the rest of this.
I think there's a lot of stuff in the book that, if we're coming back to like, not quite reviewing, because we're not like giving a bloody mark out of 10 or anything, but in terms of the book, if you're going to read it, it's excellent writing, but the negative is it's extremely of its time, and you have to have that caveat when going into it.
Yeah.
The hope is that with the whole podcast is that people, if you haven't read the book, if you have read the book, then you're kind of, joining into the conversation almost.
Yeah.
But if you haven't read the book, if it's something we like, or even if it's just interesting, that you will be inspired to go out and read this material and have your own thoughts and internal discussion and all that. So the best we can do is at least give, as I said, good writing, but be wary of the language and the writing that's used and the topics and the way they're approached and everything like that.
And I don't necessarily think that something being of its time is a bad thing. Like, there are things that
depends on the time.
Yeah, doesn't it just? Yeah, no, I suppose you're right, yeah.
It's like, this piece of media is from late 30s Germany. Like, I don't know about that.
A bit dangerous, isn't it?
The most progressive person at that time probably still wasn't by today's standards.
I laugh like Jimmy Carr.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
It's terrible.
I think we're coming around in a good way, and we've done almost an hour and a half on this. So
yeah.
I think we've
Do you think that's it?
I think we've got into the general big themes without spoiling the story. So I generally, in terms of like discussing the comic, the ending is go out, read these stories, read them from issue to issue.
It's so fun.
Exactly. One thing we do have to end on is, so one thing that's important is we've only really covered half. We haven't touched the ending, but also we haven't got into it in such detail that I don't think we really have to. I will say the ending is one of the best endings to a story, in my opinion, ever.
I would like to do a part 2 where we specifically talk about the last issue, panel by panel.
I think we could do a smaller mini episode.
Yeah.
So literally like hit like the comic out in front of us almost, like this is what we like, this is what we don't kind of thing.
If you'd like to hear that.
Or if you'd like to hear it,
please send your comment on a postcard.
Yes. We're going to set up some stuff. We'll do that at the end. Okay. You know what I might do, because I haven't set up any of the stuff yet. So what I might do is record later
at home.
Just tack it. Yeah. Well, no, I mean like us later. So like I need to set up like Twitter and
that'll be
TikTok
fun.
And an Instagram, whatever.
I'm excited for that.
Once those are done, we'll do like a recording later.
TikTok.
Yeah, we'll do TikTok.
I want TikTok.
But we'll tack it onto the end of this episode, like even after it's published. Like,
okay, cool.
Like, add it on later. But we're gonna have like some means of contact, and obviously we're gonna love to hear anyone's opinion who would listen to this podcast.
If anybody's listened,
if you exist, like get in touch.
Yeah, say hello. It's all good fun.
But one thing that we do have to end on, which is very important, which I'm just trying to find here, is there's a cat on me again. That might be dangerous. So one thing that's really important that we do need to get into just before the end is alternate titles for the comic, which I've written myself.
I love it. Go on then.
So
I'm sitting back in my chair and moving the microphone for this bit.
This is Comic Stand's alternate titles for a comic. It's going to be hopefully a recurring theme if I can be asked to write them. Exactly. So we'll start off with, and these are, I whittled these down from like the shit ones to what I think are the best.
So these are the creme de la titles.
These are the creme de la creme of titles. So we start off the most obvious. Why? The philosophical man.
Okay.
But it says specifically, it's
these are the best ones.
It's not why. It's why.
Why? Yeah, I get it. With a question mark.
And then we've got Sigh, the boring man.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I like that.
But like,
yeah, I'm with you.
The oh my, the surprised man.
Which is Yorick. Anytime
it's
something
him most
happens.
of the time. Yeah. We have Ty, the Southeast Asian man.
Hashtag problematic.
I mean, that is he is the man in this comic is exactly what it says on the tin.
Absolutely.
Yeah? We have Hi, the arriving man.
Oh, I love it.
But that's a two-part because the second part is
Bye,
the leaving man. As opposed to By the bisexual man, which was like the runner-up that I think I cut out.
Is that the one you jettisoned?
I think in favour of the two-part joke, obviously.
Yeah, obviously.
Die, the D&D playing man.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so because Die was an obvious one, but like with the dead man, like that's no fun. The Undertaker, yeah, that's no fun. Fry, the Futurama man.
We're getting to the bottom of the list now, aren't we?
I mean, well, we'll see how we go. Guy, the man.
I mean, that's
he's Guy, he's a man.
He's Guy,
man.
He's Guy.
Yeah, this one it's a bit of like commentary, like societal, satirical.
I'm leaning back forward.
It's going to be very subtle, satirical, scathing humor. So I'm seeing if you can pick up on this. Okay. Lie, the political man.
Well, I mean, that's cutting.
You know what? I just cut right to the right to the core of the issue, and I'll say anything, mate. You can't stop me. This one is.
Let's have one more.
No, we've got two more.
We've got two more.
Second last. Nye, the misquoting Monty Python man.
That took me a minute.
And last but not least, Pie, the Northern man. It's British. It's a local humour.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a local British. Up north. They love pies.
If you're not from England, just Google If you're not from England, Google pie butty.
I don't know what that is.
Well, it's exactly what it says on the tin, mate. It's a pie
butty.
It's a pie between two pieces of bread.
Okay.
Jesus,
that's so many carbs.
Oh, mate, it's a meal.
No wonder the life expectancy is lower up there.
Fucking is.
I'd love to get like American and Australian listeners who are just like who learn about British culture through us
because we're a
couple of southern fairies.
Hey, I'm from East Anglia.
Yeah, that's in the Well, it's eastern. Are we in? We must be south, aren't we? We're of the north-south divide. We're south, aren't we?
We're south of Birmingham, so yeah.
Yeah, even though we're technically eastern, so we're kind of like we're not like the north, but we're like.
I don't like Southerners.
Yeah, but then I would say we are Southerners.
I know, and I detest that about myself.
That's self-hating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Hence my self-loathing.
Like, I hate the South, but you are the South. Exactly. I'm depressed. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, so we've ended on a high point, and I think that's good. We're going to have all the information. We're going to cut it in. We're going to splice it into the end here. Yeah. So, but we'll have a Twitter. We'll have a LinkedIn for professional use. We'll have a dream catcher, and I don't know if that's used for communications.
I
these
really
days.
want a PO box.
A PO box. Yeah.
I desperately want a PO box.
We'll get a physical PO box if someone wants to write us a letter. Maybe send us some anthrax in the post, something like that. Because you can't send anthrax over email. I think that's
it's difficult, isn't it?
People on their phones, bloody, wasting their lives away. You know that spiel. But we're gonna have all that. I will be launching a comic-based YouTube channel very soon. All I just need to do is learn how to edit video, and then I'll be running. But that will be under the Comic Stan name. Maybe you'll do a thing.
I'll do a thing. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, one day.
Basket weaving. I'll do something.
Yeah, we'll get some photos of the basket weaving. But the main thing as well is once we've got all that information, that's going to be your job at the end of the podcast.
I'm so excited.
So I'll do the intro, you'll do the outro.
I love it. I'm there for it. I'm there for it.
And next episode, we haven't quite decided yet.
It'll be something.
Something good, yeah. If not a little thing, big thing. I mean, the fact that we got a bloody hour and a half out of this, like we could do one issue of bloody, what's a bad comic?
We could do one issue of the Rick and Morty comics.
No, well, that as well. But one thing I was going to suggest we do at some point is there's a WWE comic.
I'm there for it.
It's probably
Can we get
terrible.
Amber in for that one?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Well, we need a third mic.
Yeah, it'll be fine.
We'll get one. Once we've got the budget for a third mic, we'll do the WWE comic as a celebration. All right, that's a good way to end on. So thank you for listening. Enjoy comics. Read comics. Go to your local comic book store and come back next time.
Bye.
Goodbye.